Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we are starting with Jonah's story now. And we're going to go through his story and everything that happens concerning the people of Nineveh and with Jonah, the prophet whom he has sent. So we're going to see everything that takes place, and we're just going to see some interesting things unfold and go about with the storyline here. So, Jonah chapter 1, verse 1 says this. Now the word of the Lord came unto Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, so that's verse 1. The word of the Lord comes on to Jonah, which indicates that he is a prophet, and, God has something that he is to tell Jonah, and we're going to see that it's for a purpose and for these people, these men of Nineveh, and just for that whole city. We're going to see that as we go forward here. But here is verse 2. So, Jonah chapter 1, verse 2. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me. So it says, arise, go to Nineveh, which is considered a great city. And, it's considered a great city because when we look at this is further ahead, but it talks about how many people were there, and it says 60,000 persons were there, more than 60,000 persons. So 60 is basically 20 times 6. So we've got 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120,000 people in this population of this city here. So, another thing I wanted to talk about, the men of Nineveh were not actually of the Israelites, that they were not Jewish. Like the Ninevites were Gentiles, and they were pagans and so on and so forth, which means they worshiped other gods and other deities other than the Most High God. And, they were doing a bunch of things that God was displeased with, even though they were not part of his covenant as with Israel. And, we see here in the text, it says, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me. So, they're actually Assyrians that, it's basically to take note of here. And, they are, they're not the Israelite people, but they're the men of Nineveh. And let's see here. Also, to take note of, they are actually Semitic, which means they are the descendants of Shem, just like Abraham is. So they come from the same son of Noah that pretty much the whole earth was basically with the three sons of Noah. And we have that pretty much the whole earth was over, basically overspread by the three sons of Noah, that it was repopulated after the flood from the three sons of Noah that came forth from the ark. But Shem is the middle child, and basically the Israelites come from Shem because Abraham comes from Shem, and the men of Nineveh also are direct descendants from Shem. So, we have that, and, they are, basically, they are kind of closely linked, so to speak, but they're not, they don't have that covenant with God and all that, but still God comes against the men of Nineveh, desiring to use Jonah as his prophet, whom he has called and whom the Spirit of the Lord has spoken to. And when we read Jonah chapter 1, verse 3 here, but Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish to be paid the fare thereof, and went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So basically, we take note of here, Jonah he fled. God gave him a command to do something, and he just flees. And we're going to see why he does that, because we're going to get into the mindset of Jonah, because he's asked to do something for the Lord, right? But the reason he doesn't want to go and be a prophet is because pretty much, he was afraid to do it. Reason being, because, he had a big message against, the men of that generation's everything that they were doing, right? And basically God had that message for them. And Jonah, we see here that basically he's afraid to deliver this message to the men of Nineveh. He's afraid to do it, so he flees from the presence of God, and he tries to go to Tarshish by ship. And basically his mindset is, I'm just going to get away from Israel, and I'll get away from God too. But what we come to find out is that he cannot get away from God, because we're going to see what happens next year as we continue in the text. So Jonah chapter 1 verse 4, but the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. So a great wind was sent into the sea, and this big, fierce storm is coming upon them when they're in the ship at sea. And it's a very, very bad storm, right? Like, it's probably viciously shaking the ship side to side, but on top of that, a bunch of water is probably entering in through the ship that pretty much, it's like waves of water, and all this stuff is coming against them. And Jonah, we're going to find him to be asleep the whole time, but the men in the ship are basically very fearful for their lives because of what all is taking place in here, and what all is going on with this fierce storm that they go through. So we get here to let's see, we just read mighty tempest in the sea, that the ship was like to be broken. Basically, it was so bad that the ship was even going to be broken, because it was so fierce and so wild. And it's just seeing all this stuff that it just takes place here. And God is trying to get Jonah's attention in this, to get him to do what his will is, to get him to come and speak to the men of Nineveh. And when we read Jonah chapter 1 verse 5, then the mariners were afraid, and cried every man unto his God, because they're all, they're different, they all have different gods, they're different nations of people and whatnot within the ship. And everyone's praying to his God and crying on to their God. And they cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it off them. But Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. So Jonah's asleep. They're, fearful for their lives at this point because, they're sitting there throwing out everything in the ship, whether it's valuable or not, because they're just trying to save their own lives because their lives are at stake at this point, and all this stuff is going on. Jonah is, again, he's fearful for his life, so he flees from the Lord of hosts and the Most High God. That, he just doesn't want to do what he was being called to do by God. So he just says, basically, he's going to go to Tarshish and just escape from it and not do it. And we see that this happens here, this very fierce storm and these fierce winds, and the ship is in danger of breaking in half and just sinking to the bottom of the ocean and the sea right here. So Jonah chapter 1 verse 6, so the shipmaster came to him and said unto him, What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise, call upon thy God, if so be that God will think upon us that we perish not. So, the shipmaster, which basically means the captain of the ship, the one that's, captain of the ship. He's basically saying, why are you here sleeping? Rise up, call upon your God, and it might be that God will think upon us and that everybody will not perish in the midst of the sea, that everybody will be all right and everything will be good, right? And it's just a very noteworthy thing here to see what's going on, that they're all calling upon their gods, and they're all trying to figure out what's going, like why it's happening and what's going on, because there is a reason for it happening. And Jonah chapter 1 verse 7 here, and they said everyone to his fellow, Come and let us cast lots, that we may know for whose cause this evil is upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell upon Jonah. So when they cast lots in these days, in the ancient days of old, as we see here, casting lots is basically like it's a, they use stones with symbols on them, or they use sticks, or they use tokens to basically, like if the Jewish people would do it, they're basically asking for impartial, unbiased, advice and counsel of God at these stones or these sticks or so on and so forth. That basically, it was a form of communication in a way that they can get the answers that they're seeking to get. They casted lots, for example, when they went to divide the land, when the Jews came back, and when they, took the promised land that God told them to take and that it was for them to have, that they would inherit the land of Canaan. They casted lots for that. And, there's all these other examples where they mention how they cast lots. When they picked an apostle later on to replace Judas, who betrayed Jesus, they casted lots as well to see, and then Matthias was picked for that role and that bishopric that, was to be refilled, and, to have that, basically that position back to where it was supposed to be. And he was as the replacement. And they used this means of communication to basically have, again, impartial, unbiased advice and counsel, and the Jews would do it to God, or they would do it to communicate with God, and then everybody else would try to use it to communicate with their gods. But when they casted lots, the lots, the lot fell upon Jonah. So they all know that it's Jonah's fault. Very accurately predicted too is noteworthy here as well, that it was indeed Jonah, and they said, "Let us cast lots that we may know for whose cause this evil is upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell upon Jonah. So they know now that it's something to do with Jonah, and they have to pretty much go about, figuring out the situation from there to preserve all their lives and what they have to do. And, that's where the story's at with this. And, basically, we see here that pretty much, it's just this big kind of chaotic mess that has happened, that Jonah actually brought upon all the men that were in that ship because of his act of disobedience. But we'll also see, pretty much as an act of God's great mercy too, that he does end up forgiving him, and, we'll see everything that goes along with the story, but we don't want to jump too far ahead right now. So that's the story for today, and you'll have a blessed day.